On Easter, we get something we don't expect at all. No one in the Bible on Easter morning actually thinks that Jesus will be alive. No one. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all expect him to still be wrapped in his burial linens, still in his grave, still dead. What they get is not at all what they expect. All of them, even his closest friends, are confused and uncertain. In many accounts, it takes them days, weeks, if not a lifetime, to sort out what's taken place. So if this Easter morning you have come a bit uncertain, a bit confused, or if you have ever worried that you shouldn't be, it's okay. We join a long line of thinking people, good people, who have a hard time knowing what to think about Easter. What we get on Easter is not what any of us expect. That certainly was true in the lesson that Joey read for us this morning from Luke about two people walking on the road toward Emmaus. One is a man named Cleopas, the other is unnamed, and they're leaving Jerusalem, walking toward a town 7 miles away. It's Easter Day, probably about our time of day right now, late morning or perhaps early afternoon. Certain events have already transpired that day. At sunrise, women who had known Jesus go to his tomb to perform the customary burial rites that they hadn't been able to accomplish on Good Friday when he died. Now, at the grave, they find his body missing. They return to tell Jesus' other followers that they've had a vision. The reason that Jesus' body is missing, they say, is because he's still alive. He'll be found among the living, not in a grave with the dead. The men who hear it scoff at them, idle talk of women, but a few go to the grave and they confirm the missing body. This whole scenario, this whole weekend, is deeply disappointing for Cleopas and his unnamed colleague. Jesus has been such a mighty prophet. He has done things, spoken in moving ways about God, held their attention. Cleopas and his friend had high hopes, even dared to think that maybe this Jesus is finally the leader that they needed to save Israel from Rome's tyranny, to make their nation great again. But Jesus' words, demanding that the poor be cared for, that all be treated with dignity, rattle those in power, and he is summarily executed. So Cleopas and his friend are heading home, and they're walking and debating about everything that's taken place earlier that morning, that very first Easter day. What happens next is not at all what they had expected. Who are these two on that road to Emmaus? Cleopas doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, and the other person is unnamed. But both are called two of Jesus' disciples or students, but they're not in that core group of 12 apostles, because at the end of the story, when they dash back to Jerusalem, they meet the 11 there. 11, that's the number left in the core group, since Judas, one of the original 12, has killed himself after betraying Jesus. So Cleopas and his companion are students or followers of Jesus, but not in that inner circle. They're two people who may have been in Jesus' group for months, but perhaps just even in the last week, with all those massive crowds who gathered in Jerusalem for Passover. Many had heard Jesus talking in the temple then. We don't know. Maybe they've been hungry for something more in their lives for a long, long time. Just like us here today at King's Chapel, Cleopas and his friend could find themselves in the swirl of Easter morning events for many different reasons. Maybe to keep family or friends company, maybe to do someone a favor, or maybe because a part of us is intrigued about the man Jesus, just like Cleopas and his companions. They, like we, may have had varying levels of curiosity about who Jesus is, why his life matters, whether he really did rise from the grave. That's why I like Cleopas and his friend so much. They are asking all the questions we also have on our minds. They're never portrayed as having a blind faith or as instantly believing something that seems quite unbelievable. Rather, when we come upon them in the story, they're debating vigorously back and forth between themselves. The word used is that they're throwing words against one another. Cleopas, what do you make of the women's story? Seeing a vision that Jesus was alive? Did they mean seeing something with their eyes, or was it just an insight that they'd had? Now, if the body's gone, does that prove anything? Why did Jesus let himself be killed anyway? Is God involved in our lives in all this, or are we on our own now? Is there any hope that things can ever change? They were debating, but on balance, we know what they had decided, because Cleopas and his friends are already heading home. They think there's nothing worth sticking around Jerusalem for. In fact, in the Bible, they're the quickest ones to leave town, out by noon on Easter Day. Now, the road to Emmaus, according to Frederick Buechner, is a road we've all been on. Emmaus is any place we go that we rush off to, and we can't keep on hoping that life is more than what we see. Forget all those hopeful visions. Reality is pretty clear. Emmaus is where we go and what we do when our bubble gets burst. The beautiful, inspiring poetry about truth and life is only words. Emmaus might be a stiff drink or an exhausting workout, a trashy novel or binge TV, things that we can escape into. Sometimes it's even working too hard or sleeping too much, or darker things that end up hurting others but soothe our broken hearts. We head to Emmaus when we decide that we can be far more productive if we just get back to what we can control, try to provide some financial security for our families, stump for some good cause, raise money for the museum, anything practical. No more of these ephemeral religious notions from Jesus or about Jesus. Life is what it is. And then some stranger shows up on our road. Right there on the road to Emmaus, no one recognizes him. Cleopas and his friends can't, and often we can't either. But that seemingly big problem turns out not to matter, because this stranger, this Jesus, recognizes them and recognizes us. Cleopas and his friend don't know who the stranger is, but he knows them. Jesus clearly hasn't picked out these two because they're particularly special. We know one is literally nameless and they've both given up, but to Jesus they are worth the visit. We're spending time with, talking with, walking along life's road with them. Each is worth the whole world to him. And this is what Jesus does. He asks them an open-ended question. What were you discussing with each other while you walk along? There's no condemnation, not a whisper of that. Instead, he asks an open question, the kind any of us need when our worries are a swirl of thoughts and we're actually still torn inside. So we just stop and we stand still in the middle of the road like those two did, not sure what to say really, because it takes all our strength to think, what is the thing most on my mind? What is most important to me? Jesus asked just one open-ended question because he isn't trying to obtain facts as if at a trial. He isn't trying to assess their credibility. He just cares about how they are, really. And then he listens. He listens for as long as they need. Sounds like he hears about the new excitement that they had felt, how their hopes for a new beginning had been raised, the message they thought that a wise one had offered. And from you, what would he hear from you? What would be the big things swirling in your mind today about maybe a new relationship or a new venture that could use your talents, or perhaps about a love lost an opportunity lost, about days far too busy and stressed or far too empty. All the things that don't make sense, the way life hasn't turned out the way we expected. And then when we are done, the stranger offers a different angle on it, a way to see life from a different way. He calls them foolish, the lesson said, a word that raises my hackles, but the real word in the original is unmindful. That's a word we hear in Buddhism too, the way we sometimes are unable to notice, to really be aware of what's happening all around us. Maybe it's spring unfurling its buds, or that plea that is etched in a child's face, do I matter? We're unmindful sometimes, missing the essence, focused on the wrong things, but Jesus conveys that he wants to help us retune our hearts and our minds to what matters, and don't we want that too, that kind of mindfulness. Jesus also calls them slow of heart, maybe meaning selfish, for we all can be, God knows, but maybe meaning the kind of slowness that would be in your heart with an exhausted heart. You know, burnout that comes from trying too hard, compassion fatigue because needs seem so huge and we seem so small. Ministers that I worked with in the 1990s here in Boston on gang issues bonded with police officers serving the same young men because all of them, the ministers and the cops, had to fight that hardening of their hearts, the slowing of their hearts. All the times they had tried to save someone and failed. It was easier to be indifferent. Jesus sees their slowness of heart and offers a new perspective. It makes me think, with the Reverend Buechner, that maybe the reason the two of them on the road to Emmaus couldn't recognize Jesus because they'd never really seen who he was. Now, they'd seen a warrior leader, a Messiah astride a steed who musters an army and crashes a whole Roman Empire. But Jesus' version of a liberated Israel was a people brought back to their true center, where those ancient words of Isaiah that we read this morning and those predictions from Revelation both came true, remember? Where no infant lives only a few days, nor do workers labor in vain, where widows and orphans are cared for, new streams of courage flow in the parched desert, justice rolling down like mighty waters. How can the world be transformed when God's kingdom is known on earth because we refuse violence? Share what we have, feed the whole world, because you know this year, 2016, we can feed the whole world right now and eliminate starvation here, elsewhere with the technology in our hands, the wealth of our nation. How do we begin? But wait a minute, who would lead us? Sir, you don't really think that love is stronger than weaponry, Cleopas and his friends say. Don't really tell us that forgiveness changes lives, that we're supposed to feed the world, for who would lead us? Oh, but wait, sir, wait, please. The sun is sinking. Emmaus is just around this bend. Don't go on tonight. Stay with us. Two ordinary people just like us asking, stay with us. So he does. And what they get is not at all what they expect. For as they sit down for supper, he takes a loaf of bread, and he blesses it, and he breaks it into pieces to share with them, to share with the whole world. And then they recognize him. Those same gestures, you know, they were the same ones that Jesus had used when he broke bread with 5,000 people sitting on a hillside, when no one had known how they could possibly be fed, and only a little child had been rash enough to share his skimpy meal. But everyone had been. Inspired, I think, to take out the morsels that they had tucked away in their cloaks for that day's journey, inspired by a child, and we find that 5,000 are willing to share what they had, and all had been fed, with baskets left over beside. Jesus, it was Jesus, they said, there with them, breaking bread and sharing it with them now, as he'd spent his whole life doing that. Gathering people and sharing the bread, the prostitutes and tax collectors and anyone who was despised or left out, all gathered in love, sharing one meal, sharing their bread, plenty enough for them all. His love knew no bounds. They feasted on it. When Jesus shared his loaf of bread with them at that table in Emmaus, they recognized him as a leader they had been yearning for, feeding their deepest hunger. And now they had a new way of seeing him. It no longer required going back to find his old body. They asked Jesus to stay with him, and he'd said yes to them, as he does to any who ask. All of us nameless ones, even we who have given up on him, headed the wrong way out of town. Yes, he promises, I will always stay with you when you ask. That's why it didn't matter one bit to them that Jesus vanished from their sight again. The two in Emmaus had realized that they could see him, could stay with him without ever needing to find his body. They didn't need to actually lay eyes on him again. The body could be lifeless, but they were alive. And love would stay alive with them in a new way, even more plenteously than it could have before. More plenteously available to them than when he was just one man in just one body. He might seem dead, but their hearts had burst into flame, and he'd explained his way of living mindfully, centering on sharing bread with everyone. Though the world had done the worst it could to a human body, God as love was alive and well. Whenever they showed love, they were connected to God and one another. Resurrection is love persisting past death. Whoever you are and wherever you are on your life's journey, that's where the risen power of love will come and find you. And the ways you expect him to look, my guess is if you're expecting a warrior, you might not notice him on the road next to you at first. And if you're expecting one of those other childhood pictures of God that most of us have, a distant creator, a king on a throne, a condemning judge, a scolding father, an ineffective do-gooder, my guess is with those, you might not even want to strike up the conversation when he tries to converse with you. But if something weighs on you today, nearly bringing you to a standstill, if you are debating what to make of what's happening in your life, then tell the God that you would find trustworthy, even if he looks just like a stranger. Tell the one who listens as long as you need to speak, listens without condemnation, and see what happens. And if you are hungry, looking for one to feed your deepest hungers, feed the world's deepest needs, well, then I think he may show up sooner than you expect. Because on Easter, what we expect is not at all what we get. What we get is something far, far better. Amen.